My talk's about the Battleship Bismarck, as you know, and that was World War II. But before I go into World War II, I just want to take us back to the end of World War I. Not surprisingly, there was widespread support for limiting arms expenditure generally, and in particular, limiting the number of the world's battleships. And in 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty was signed in order to prevent a battleship arms race. And it laid down a ratio of battleships as Britain 5, USA 5, Japan 3, France and Italy 1.75 proportionately. Battleships under construction were stopped and older ships scrapped. In addition, there was to be a battleship holiday with no new battleships allowed to be built for 10 years. And displacement for new battleships was limited to 35,000 tons. In January 1930, there was a further naval conference, this time in London. The conference agreed parity between the USA and Britain at 15 battleships each and allowed Japan 9 battleships. Importantly, the 10-year battleship holiday was extended another 5 years until the 31st of December 1936. HMS Rodney and HMS Nelson were built under this treaty. Then in October 1935, just before the battleship holiday was due to end, the USA unexpectedly offered to support a reduction in gun size for new battleships to 14-inch on 35,000 tons displacement. And an agreement on this was quickly reached between the USA, Britain, and France. But Japan refused to sign the treaty. And so an escalation clause was introduced, which allowed for guns to rise to 16-inch caliber if Japan had not signed within 12 months. Now, the result of this was that Britain immediately commenced building the King George V class of battleships, which mounted 14-inch guns on a design displacement of 35,000 tons. But in April 1937, the Japanese, having failed to sign the London Treaty, the treaty gun size limit automatically rose to 16-inch, and the USA immediately began to build ships with these weapons. Sadly for Britain, it was too late to alter the King George V class, but work started immediately on designing 4 Lion-class battleships, and they were expected to mount 9 16-inch guns. But shortly after World War II began, these ships were cancelled. Let's now look at Germany. The German High Seas Fleet, of course, had been interned in Scapa Flow, scuttling itself on the 21st of June 1919, and leaving the post-war German Navy with a tiny navy. And here is the pre-dreadnought battleship Schlesien. The Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War forbade Germany from building submarines, but did allow her to build battleships, but only of 10,000 tons each, which was very small. And the 3 pocket battleships of the early 1930s were the result. Now, these ships had relatively heavy guns and high speed, but had to sacrifice armor in order to achieve the desired displacement. Meanwhile, in Germany, in secret, design work had already started in 1933 on 2 new battleships known as F and G. Initially, this work envisaged a 35,000-ton battleship armed with 13-inch guns. But when Hitler abrogated the Treaty of Versailles in early 1935, Gross Admiral Raeder decreed that gun caliber was now to be 38 centimeter or 15-inch, and the displacement was allowed to rise to 41,000 tons. Now, the design settled on 12 boilers feeding 3 sets of geared turbines and 3 propeller shafts, producing an output of 150,000 shaft horsepower, which gave a maximum speed of 30 knots. The 15-inch guns individually weighed over 100 tons, while each of the 4 twin gun turrets weighed 1,060 tons. And they had an ammunition supply of 108 rounds per gun. Each shell weighed 800 kilos and fired at a muzzle velocity of 820 meters a second, could penetrate 14 inches of armor plate at 21 kilometers range. Rate of fire was approximately 2.5 rounds per minute per gun. The armor on the turret faces was over a foot thick, and each turret was fitted with a 10-meter base rangefinder, although, as you can see in this picture, this was removed from a turret after completion. Controlling all this firepower were 2 gunnery computer rooms. Now, the secondary armament of the Bismarck was out of date in concept, in that it combined an anti-destroyer battery of 6 twin 5.9-inch guns, as well as 8 twin 4-inch heavy anti-aircraft guns. British and American practice by now was to use dual-purpose guns of 5.25-inch in case of the British and 5-inch in the case of the American calibers. And these were equally effective against destroyers and aircraft. Below this caliber, the Battleship F, had 16 37mm anti-aircraft guns and 12 20mm light anti-aircraft guns. Finally, Battleship F had 3 main armament rangefinders. 2 were 10-meter base instruments, one in the foretop and one in the after fire control position. And there was also a smaller 7-meter instrument in the forward fire control position. And before completion, radar aerials were fitted to the 2 10-meter rangefinders. And you can see the radar there fitted to the rangefinder in the after control post. So let's look at life on board. Well, Battleship F was launched by her builders, Blom and Voss, in Hamburg in February 1939 and christened Bismarck. She commissioned on the 24th of August 1940 and received her captain, Ernst Lindemann. He was aged 45. He'd served throughout World War I. He's described as a man of boundless energy who chain smoked and drank coffee constantly. The ship conducted tests and trials during the autumn and during the winter, and it transited the Kiel Canal between the Baltic and the North Sea. Bismarck now began working up in company with the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. Prince Eugen was armed with 8 8-inch guns, and from a distance could easily be mistaken for Bismarck. And here are some photographs of life on board Bismarck at about this time. Some of them were taken on the 15th of March 1941, and so the men you see here have only just over 2 months to live. Cobbler's shop, the galley again. The meat freezer was below the galley again and again. There's the shop, the sort of naffy, and there is mealtime for the junior ranks. Now, it was decided to mount an operation to attack British convoys using Bismarck, together with her slightly younger sister ship Tirpitz, and joined by the battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which were to sail out of Brest, where they were, in order to join up with the Bismarck and Tirpitz. Luckily for the Royal Navy, Tirpitz's completion was delayed, and both Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were under repair. And so Bismarck made her sortie with only the cruiser Prince Eugen. The sortie was called Rheinübung or Exercise Rhine. Now, in overall command of Rheinübung was Admiral Gunther Lütjens. Lütjens was 52. He was an extremely able commander, and although he looks rather forbidding here, he wasn't a Nazi. And in fact, here you can see that when he meets Hitler, he gives the naval salute, whereas many of the other officers present are giving the Hitler salute. He'd been awarded the Knight's Cross for his service in the Norwegian campaign in 1940, and he then led a successful raid on British convoy routes in the Atlantic with the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and this made him the perfect choice to lead Rheinübung. Well, at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 19th of May, Bismarck and Prince Eugen sailed from Gotenhafen through the Skagerrak and then into the Kattegat as dawn rose on the 20th of May. To starboard of the ships lay Sweden, neutral but sympathetic to Britain. And at noon, the Swedish cruiser Gotland appeared and immediately radioed the German fleet's presence to Stockholm. A report on the move was received in London, and since a breakout north or south of Iceland seemed likely, HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales sailed from Scapa Flow for Iceland to be in readiness. Meanwhile, the two German ships arrived near Bergen in Norway at about midday on the 21st of May. Prince Eugen anchored and refueled from a tanker, while Bismarck anchored in the nearby Grimstad Fjord. Now that's Grimstad Fjord then. Here it is today, and there it is back then. Lütjens decided not to allow Bismarck to refuel, as he was concerned about being caught by a possible British air raid. Indeed, here's a photo taken that day by a photo reconnaissance Spitfire. However, this decision not to refuel was to have serious consequences later, as we shall see. Then, when the RAF arrived to bomb the ships next day, they found that the ships were gone. But where had they gone? Well, there are 4 routes available to the Atlantic for Lütjens to choose, and he opted for the gap between Iceland and the Greenland ice shelf, which is number 4 on this map. This gap was furthest from Scapa Flow, but it was narrow. Lütjens was probably confident that he could get through and be away before any battleship from Scapa Flow arrived. But what Lütjens didn't know was that Hood and Prince of Wales had already sailed for Iceland. Then, in the evening of the 22nd of May, the battleship King George V, with the Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet, Vice Admiral Tovey, embarked on board, sailed from Scapa Flow with the aircraft carrier Victorious, plus 5 light cruisers and 6 destroyers. And soon afterwards, they were joined by the battle cruiser Repulse, and this fleet set course for the southern tip of Iceland in order to back up the Hood and Prince of Wales. Back to the Germans, they were now passing Norway, and they passed close to a pre-positioned tanker, but once again, Admiral Lütjens refused to allow Bismarck to be refueled. Now, the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. It varies in width as the ice shelf advances or retreats with the season. And in May, it's about 90 miles wide. But this was actually reduced to about 30 miles because the British had put in a minefield extending out from the Icelandic coast. And the Germans knew this. And so when they transited the Denmark Strait, they stayed very close to the edge of the ice shelf, sailing in line ahead, Bismarck leading and shining a searchlight astern to assist Prince Eugen in maintaining contact, as you can see from this photograph. Well, ahead of them, patrolling the Denmark Strait, were 2 Royal Navy heavy cruisers, Suffolk and Norfolk. They were under the command of Rear Admiral William Wake Walker. And at 1922 hours, on the 23rd of May, they detected Bismarck and began to shadow her. On board Bismarck, the concussion of her 15-inch guns firing a few salvos at Norfolk caused her foretop radar to break down. And so Prince Eugen now took the lead. And this change was not noticed by the British cruisers and was to become a significant factor in the battle which lay ahead. Well, on hearing the sighting reports of the Bismarck, Admiral Holland on board HMS Hood, with Prince of Wales in company, determined to intercept Bismarck, knowing that Admiral Tovey was not far behind. And throughout the night of the 23rd and 24th of May, the two British cruisers provided precise locations, course, and speed of the two German ships. The Germans monitored these transmissions, but Lütjens wasn't worried, as he had expected to encounter cruisers in that area. But of course, what Lütjens did not know was that Hood, and this, by the way, is the last photograph taken of Hood by a British camera, and the Prince of Wales were now less than 300 miles away and closing fast. Admiral Holland on Hood intended to intercept the German ships just before dawn next morning, 24th of May. And now we come to the Battle of the Denmark Strait. Well, during the night, Bismarck circled back, trying to catch the two British cruisers by surprise and destroy them. The cruisers managed to evade Bismarck, but they lost contact for some 3 hours. And this prompted Admiral Holland now to alter course to the southwest to be more certain that the enemy ships would not pass ahead of him. And all was now set for what was to go down in history as the Battle of the Denmark Strait. At 0537, lookouts on both sides spotted smoke on the horizon, and the guns were now loaded and trained towards the enemy. And here is the loading and firing sequence for a British 15-inch gun. As you see, the shells and the cordite taken up and then rammed into the breech. And here are some photographs that have been taken inside a British 15-inch gun turret. See the size of these guns. And if it works, here is a bit of film of the loading sequence. You can see the shell being rammed in. So that's the shell being rammed in, and then the cordite charges, 2, and then another 2 being rammed in behind. The breech is closed and the guns are elevated for firing. That film was taken on board HMS Vanguard, our last battleship, just before she was scrapped. Now, the range between the two pairs of ships was now about 30,000 yards or 15 miles. And Vice Admiral Holland's plan was to place his two ships in a position where they could cross the German T. So as you can see from that sketch, he wanted to end up with the Germans heading straight for him. In other words, he would block the enemy's path and could bring all his own guns fore and aft to bear on the enemy, whereas the enemy would only bring their guns in their forward turrets to bear. And unfortunately for Holland, what he found was that it was the enemy that was crossing his T. This meant that the Germans had 8 15-inch and 8 8-inch guns ranged against 4 15-inch and 6 14-inch of the British. So the only way that Admiral Holland could make full use of his theoretical superiority in gun power would be to turn to port and run parallel to the German ships. Now, the problem with that was that Admiral Holland knew well that doing this at long range would expose Hood to the plunging fire which sank 3 British battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland in the First World War. Holland would have wanted to close the range as rapidly as possible in order to get HMS Hood into her immune zone. Now, this is the zone between the range below which enemy shells, diving steeply, just failed to penetrate a ship's relatively thin deck armor, and the range above which the enemy's shells at short range and with a flat trajectory failed to penetrate the thick side armor. Hood was known to suffer from weak deck armor. She'd been designed during the First World War. So ideally, Holland needed to fight at medium range, and in order to get to this range, say below about 18,000 yards or 9 miles, he would initially have to approach almost head on to the enemy with half his guns unable to bear. Well, on board HMS Hood, it was assumed that the leading German ship was Bismarck. And indeed, the 2 German ships were remarkably similar in appearance at long range. And so Holland ordered both his ships to fire on the leading enemy ship. In Prince of Wales, the gunnery officer realized that this was an error and he targeted Bismarck from the start. Hood, however, at 0552, opened fire on Prince Eugen at a range of 25,000 yards or 12 miles. At this range, the flying time of the heavy shells was about 50 seconds. Prince of Wales opened fire shortly after, and one of the 2 guns in her B turret promptly developed a fault, which meant that it couldn't fire again in the battle. 2 minutes after the British opened fire, Admiral Lutyens gave permission for his ships to fire, and Prince Eugen fired immediately. She could fire 3 shells a minute from each of her 8-inch guns, and her shooting was incredibly accurate, hitting Hood with her second salvo. As you can see, that's the Hood there, but that is bombs falling around her in the Mediterranean earlier on, but it gives you the rough idea. Now, Prince Eugen's hit exploded on Hood's deck, causing a raging fire amongst the ready use lockers for anti-aircraft ammunition. Bismarck opened fire 1 minute later at a range of 21,000 yards, which gave a shell flying time of about 32 seconds. Her first salvo landed close to Hood, but a little bit short and a little bit ahead. Seeing the towering waterspouts, Admiral Holland realized his mistake in identifying the ships, and he ordered fire to be shifted 1 ship right onto Bismarck. Of course, Prince of Wales was already targeting Bismarck, but Hood appears to have continued firing at Prince Eugen, possibly due to some confusion in the passage of commands. Well, Admiral Lutyens on board Bismarck now ordered the Prince Eugen to shift target left to Prince of Wales. Meanwhile, the Bismarck's first gunnery officer, Korvettenkapitan Adalbert Schneider, had corrected the range and deflection of his first salvo and ordered a 400-meter bracketing group to be fired. This involved 2 turrets, in other words, 4 guns, firing at a range calculated to be 200 meters over the target, followed shortly after by the other 2 turrets, firing 4 guns at a range calculated to be 200 meters under the range of the target. All 8 shells would therefore be in the air at the same time, and if the first of these 4 guns landed over and the second group landed short, then they had accurately straddled the target. In fact, the first of the salvos did land over, but the second salvo straddled the Hood, and with 1 or more shells falling beyond the Hood and 1 or more falling short of the Hood, which meant that that second salvo was absolutely on target. Now, because heavy shells will land anywhere from 50 meters to 250 meters apart. And because actual hits on an enemy ship might not be visible, because the shell could penetrate and either explode deep inside and you can't see it, or maybe it doesn't explode, then only by seeing the shell splashes can you be sure of where the shells are landing. So what you're trying to achieve is a straddle. In other words, shells falling on both sides of the enemy. And I hope this diagram will show you what I mean. So these shots have gone over and left, and then the next 4 short and right, and the next salvo is a straddle. That's what you want to achieve. And you keep firing like that, hoping to get a hit. That shows you the general way that shots fall. That's American battle practice in the 1930s, but you can see that, you know, however well you try, however accurate your rangefinders are and the guns, the shells will fall a few hundred yards around a certain point. There's a straddle, again I think it was in the 1920s, American. And there's a perfect straddle on a HOOD target. Now, again, if the film works, here is a film taken from Prince Eugen of the Bismarck during the battle itself. That is, those 2 guns are on Prince Eugen. So remember, this film is taken on board Prince Eugen. There's Bismarck, fired its main battery guns. If you watch, there will now be a smaller explosions. Those are its 5.9-inch guns firing. And there'll be a shell landing, a British shell landing there just on the right. And another shell in a moment will land on the left. There, just at the edge of the photograph of the film. Those are the 6-inch guns firing, and that's the main, the after turrets of the 15-inch guns firing. Now that's film of the 2 British ships in the distance, and I come on to that in a minute. Well, the range was now around 18,000 yards or 9 miles, and at 5:59, Admiral Holland at last ordered a 20-degree turn to port to allow the after turrets of his 2 ships to fire. The steadily decreasing range now made HOOD less vulnerable to plunging fire, although the actual act of turning to port has the effect of causing the ship to heel to starboard, in other words, towards the Bismarck, and thus that made her more vulnerable to plunging fire for the duration of the turn. And here you can see British shells falling firstly short and then a few seconds later over the Bismarck. Well, Bismarck's 4th salvo at HOOD fell a close short, but at a range of 17,000 meters, her 5th salvo achieved a perfect straddle. HOOD was now in the middle of her 20-degree turn to port, and we know this because her rudder is still turned hard to port on the seabed. And with the helm hard over and traveling at 28 knots, HOOD heeled perhaps 10 or 20 degrees towards the enemy. And when 1 or more of Bismarck's 5th salvo shells landed in the vicinity of HOOD's mainmast, its angle of striking would have been the same as if it had been fired at much longer range. The effect of this was, of this shell or shells, was that it penetrated HOOD's decks and exploded deep within the ship. Now, this is a section of HOOD showing her relatively weak deck armor. A diving shell, and remember she was heeled towards the enemy, would thus face 2 inches of deck armor plus 1 or more other armored decks or bulkheads, totaling only around 4 inches or so. After World War I, after the Hood was designed, the Royal Navy introduced the all or nothing concept of one thick deck rather than several weaker ones. And this is illustrated here by HMS Rodney, designed after the First World War. And she's got one deck armor, and it is 6 inches thick. Interestingly, Bismarck's armor scheme actually was closer to Hood's than Rodney's, but it was thicker than Hood's. Well, when the shell exploded in Hood, this is what happened. Now, the exact sequence of events may never be known, but the most likely series of events are that a shell penetrated and exploded in the 4-inch anti-aircraft ammunition magazine near the mainmast, which in turn drove red-hot fragments into the main 15-inch magazine of X turret, which exploded, in turn causing Y turret magazine to explode. Now, between them, they housed more than 100 tons of cordite, which would have burned like a gigantic blowtorch in what's called a deflagration. The blast swept forward then through the engine rooms, and it vented up the air intakes to the engine rooms. And it's also believed to have reached A and B turrets magazines, causing them to ignite as well. And this is suspected because the 500-ton conning tower structure was located on the seabed almost a mile from the main hull section, which it was attached to. And also tellingly, on the wreck, the roof of Hood's A turret, there on the right, is missing. Now, that doesn't just fall off if the ship turns over. It's likely to have been blown off. Now, this is what the explosion looked like. Captain Leach of HMS Prince of Wales, following only about 2 cables, 400 yards away. And he made that drawing for the Board of Inquiry into the sinking. And that's what it looked like from the German heavy cruiser Prince Eugen. That's actual photograph. A quick word now about magazines and shell rooms. A magazine in a World War II battleship is a heavily armored compartment packed with powder-filled charges, which were rammed into the guns behind the shell. Then when the gun was fired, they burned and drove the shell up the barrel. Shell rooms were similar to magazines, but they were full of high explosive shells. Now, up to the Battle of Jutland, most navies, including the Royal Navy, placed shell rooms below magazines. However, the experience of the 3 battle cruisers blowing up at Jutland caused a rethink. An enemy shell that penetrated a shell room and exploded would not necessarily cause the shells stored there to explode, but the slightest penetration of a powder magazine by hot splinters, let alone a complete exploding shell, would result in the entire cordite store igniting and burning. And when I say burn, this is a technicality. The burning would be so rapid and the pressure increase so great that the effect would be like an explosion. And here some more film shows the battleship HMS Barham in the Mediterranean. She's just been torpedoed, and she capsizes and her magazine explodes, her after magazine explodes. It's quite terrifying. Well, there's a still, and there is a picture showing the Bismarck, and as I mentioned before, it had its magazines above the shell rooms, which was not a good move. There is HMS Hood exploding, a scene from the Prince Eugen. And Hood was blown into two parts by the explosion. The stern sank fairly swiftly. The forward 2/3 of the ship then disappeared within 3 minutes. And there were only 3 survivors from a crew of 1,418. Prince of Wales now turned hard to starboard to avoid Hood's sinking wreck, but she was still under fire from Prince Eugen, and now Bismarck fired at her as well. Began to take hits from both German ships, and in total 3 8-inch shells from Prince Eugen and 4 15-inch shells from Bismarck hit Prince of Wales. But Prince of Wales was lucky. One of the 15-inch shells penetrated deep into the hull but failed to explode. 2 more passed through the upper superstructure, again without exploding. One of these actually tore right through the bridge, and it killed everybody there except the captain and 2 others, all of whom were concussed for a short time. Meanwhile, 2 of the 14-inch guns on Prince of Wales became inoperable. And when Captain Leach came to, although he was groggy, he could see that Prince of Wales was likely to be overwhelmed quickly unless he broke off the action. And so he ordered her to turn away and made smoke to conceal her from the German guns. In total, she had fired 18 salvos at the Bismarck. That's 55 shells in all. And although she didn't know it, she had hit Bismarck 3 times. And so the Battle of the Denmark Strait was over. Well, let's go back to the Bismarck. On board the Bismarck, Captain Lindemann wanted to pursue the Prince of Wales and finish her off. And since Prince of Wales's after turret had broken down as the ship turned away to escape, there can be little doubt that this is exactly what would have happened had Lindemann got his way. However, Lutyens refused. He was a German and he followed orders, and his orders were unequivocal. Avoid unnecessary risk and avoid battle with an equal opponent if you could. His task was to move out into the Atlantic and sink convoys. Unfortunately for Lutyens, 2 of the 3 14-inch hits on Bismarck presented a problem. One hit deep below the waterline, exploded, and caused a generator to room to flood, as well as cutting some of the fuel lines. One shell passed through the bows just above the waterline, but without exploding. However, it was below the bow wave, and slowly 2,000 tons of water flooded the bow area, causing the ship to run slightly bows down. More importantly, some fuel oil had been lost from ruptured fuel lines, and 1,000 tons of oil in the bows was now inaccessible and couldn't be pumped aft to the engines. Bismarck would need to enter dry dock to rectify this damage. So Lutyens decided to set course for Saint-Nazaire, which had a dry dock big enough to accommodate her. He planned to detach Prince Eugen to continue to search for convoys, and then he would return to the Atlantic later on with Bismarck once she was repaired, hopefully together with Gneisenau and Scharnhorst, which were in Brest. Well, news of the Hood's demise caused disbelief and shock throughout the Admiralty and the fleet. This soon gave way to a grim resolve to get even, and the Royal Navy now embarked upon the greatest naval hunt in history. Prince of Wales joined up with the 2 shadowing cruisers, Norfolk and Suffolk. The 16-inch gunned battleship Rodney was ordered to leave the convoy that she was escorting and head for Admiral Tovey's force, that is to say the battleship King George V, the battlecruiser Repulse, and the aircraft carrier Victorious. Meanwhile, Force H under Vice Admiral Somerville sailed from Gibraltar with the battlecruiser Renown, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, and the cruiser Sheffield. So a net was beginning to close in, which consisted of 4 battleships, 2 battlecruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. Well, later that afternoon, the 24th of May, Admiral Lutyens managed to detach Prince Eugen. He did that by Bismarck circling around and heading back towards the pursuing cruisers and Prince of Wales. And he exchanged fire with Prince of Wales before completing a circle and back on to his original course. Prince Eugen was now sufficiently far ahead to escape to the east. Later still that evening, Bismarck came under attack by torpedo-carrying swordfish from the aircraft carrier Victorious. This attack scored one hit, which caused the first fatality aboard Bismarck, but little significant damage, although it was an ominous indicator of things to come. Nevertheless, according to survivors, the crew's morale soared because they'd beaten off the attack. The 25th of May dawned, and it was Admiral Lutyens' birthday, his last birthday. At about 3 o'clock in the morning, Bismarck circled around to starboard again, and this time she didn't encounter the following cruisers. They were following, but also observing a zigzag, and they were on the outward legs of their zigzag, expecting that when they zigged back, they would see the Bismarck again, having temporarily lost radar contact. But when they completed their zigzag, it was to discover that the Bismarck was no longer there. In fact, having circled around, she was now behind the British ships and steaming for France. Well, the shadowing British ships now fanned out to the southwest in a desperate attempt to regain contact. And they didn't report the loss of contact to Admiral Tovey for nearly 3 hours, by which time his force had continued to the southwest, and unbeknown to him and unbeknown to Admiral Lutyens, the Bismarck was set to cross behind him. Admiral Lutyens assumed, however, that he was still being shadowed, and he now sent a very long radio message describing the Battle of the Denmark Strait in detail. And the British were able to now fix Bismarck's position, although initially there was an error in plotting the bearings. But by 11 o'clock, it was clear that Bismarck had slipped past behind Tovey, and after 7 hours uninterrupted steaming, she was well on her way to France. Potentially, this was a disaster for the Royal Navy. Furthermore, Prince of Wales, Repulse, Victorious, Norfolk, Suffolk, and many destroyers were now forced to give up the chase due to lack of fuel. Bismarck was now 100 miles ahead of Tovey, and the only British ships capable of intercepting her were those of Force H approaching from Gibraltar. However, Force H's flagship, the battle cruiser Renown, it might be armed with 6 15-inch guns, but it was older than Hood and its armor was weaker than Hood, and it just wasn't up to slugging it out with Bismarck in a straight fight. Well, Bismarck was now proceeding at 20 knots. It had reduced speed in order to conserve fuel. She could have maintained 28 knots had lack of fuel not been a problem. And of course, this goes back to the fact that she had not been allowed to refuel. Well, her crew now enthusiastically tried to construct a dummy second funnel to make the ship look a bit like King George V from the air. And the night passed without incident, and German morale soared. But at 10:30 on the next day, the 26th of May, a Catalina flying boat sighted the Bismarck and reported her position to the fleet. Tovey realized that he'd missed her by only about 50 miles. Now, no British ship was within 100 miles of Bismarck, but she still had 700 miles to go, and Force H was approaching her from the south. At 14:50 that day, Force H struck. It sent 15 Swordfish torpedo bombers, which took off from Ark Royal, and initially they attacked the cruiser Sheffield by mistake. but luckily there were no hits. Admiral Tovey now signaled Force H that if Bismarck couldn't be slowed or stopped by midnight that night, his battleships would have to give up the pursuit for lack of fuel. So at 19:15, 7:15 in the evening, with daylight fading, 15 swordfish were once again launched from Ark Royal. They made their way to the cruiser Sheffield, which they'd attacked earlier on, and the Sheffield was in contact with the Bismarck and directed them accurately on towards the Bismarck. This attack was driven home with great courage, and German survivors were amazed at how low the swordfish flew and how close they approached Bismarck before dropping their torpedoes. It appears that there were 2 hits on Bismarck's side armor, which caused little damage. And then, with one of the last torpedoes, a hit was achieved near the twin rudders, which were at that time set at a 12-degree turn to port. And the torpedo jammed the Bismarck's rudders. Well, damage control teams on the Bismarck investigated and found that the steering compartment was flooded by violently swirling water, which made it impossible to gain access and to delink the rudders from the steering engine in order to centralize them manually. So Captain Lindemann attempted to counter the effect of the 2 jammed rudders by using his 3 engines. However, no combination of a head or a stern seemed to work, and Bismarck simply ended up steaming head to wind every time, and head to wind was away from France. There were desperate ideas from many of the crew to solve the rudder problem. For example, dragging a shell round with a delayed fuse so the shell would blow the rudders off, but they were all rejected. And it seems that Captain Lutjens, as Captain Lindemann and Admiral Lutjens, simply gave up and accepted their fate. To make matters worse for Bismarck, from about 2300 onwards, she came under attack from a flotilla of 5 British destroyers. The destroyers attacked individually and from every side, causing considerable stress to Bismarck's fire control teams as they rapidly switched between the targets. No torpedoes hit Bismarck that night, but by morning, her crew were utterly exhausted. And then at about 8:30 on the morning of the 27th of May, the alarm bells rang on Bismarck for the last time. Her final battle was about to begin. HMS King George V and Rodney here sailed straight towards the Bismarck from the northwest, separated from each other by a distance of 6 cables or 1,200 yards. Admiral Tovey wanted to close the range as rapidly as possible until at about 15,000 yards, he would turn and allow all his turrets to bear. Well, Rodney opened fire at 8:47. King George V opened fire a minute later at 8:48, and Bismarck a minute later at 8:49. Soon afterwards, the heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Norfolk joined in with their 8-inch guns. Bismarck was under fire from all sides, and that is a photograph of Bismarck. Both Rodney and Bismarck achieved straddles with their 3rd salvos, although only Rodney's salvo contained a hit. Now this shows Rodney firing at the Bismarck the moment that she is straddled by the Bismarck. Bismarck was then hit by a steady stream of shells from all the British ships. Very early on in the action, a shell destroyed her foretop fire control station, and at 09:02, only 15 minutes after the battle started, a shell or shells from Rodney disabled both A and B turrets. Fire control was now passed to the after gunnery control position, commanded by Oberleutnant Baron von Mullenheim-Rechberg, who later was to become one of the survivors. He took King George V as his target and fired 4 salvos from C and D turrets, the 4th one of them being a straddle on King George V. As he was excitedly observing the shells of that straddling salvo, which burst 3 over and 1 short, the rangefinder cupola immediately above his station was hit by a 14-inch shell from King George V and devastated. The time was 13 minutes past 9, and Bismarck could no longer direct the guns, and so therefore Mullenheim-Rechberg ordered both after turrets to go into local control. Not long afterwards, at 09:21, a D turret was hit and disabled, its right barrel bursting like a peeled banana. C turret carried on for another 10 minutes until 9:31, when it too was forced to stop firing when a direct hit on its faceplate caused the turret to jam. Any of the 5.9-inch turrets which were still firing were soon silenced either by direct hits or by damage or fire affecting them or their magazines. With Bismarck silenced, Rodney spent over half an hour sailing up and down, firing from ranges of between 2,700 and 4,500 yards, which is, in battleship terms, point blank range. Sometimes she scored 5 or 6 hits per 9-gun broadside, which caused devastation to Bismarck's superstructure. At about 10 o'clock, on board Bismarck, orders were given to scuttle the ship, and explosive charges were set off in the engine rooms to flood the ship. Both British battleships now ceased fire and sailed away because their fuel situation was critical, and by now no other ship was firing at Bismarck. The German ship was already listing and low in the water from shell hits below the waterline, and it was clearly slowly sinking. The scuttling charges merely accelerated this, as did the cruiser Dorsetshire, which fired 2 torpedoes into Bismarck's starboard side, followed by 1 into her port side. Shortly after this, at 10:36, Bismarck rolled over and sank. Of Bismarck's crew of 2,200, only 115 were rescued. During her last battle, Bismarck had the following shells fired at her: 380 16-inch, 339 14-inch, 781 8-inch, 716 6-inch, and 660 5.25-inch. A total of 2,876 shells plus torpedoes. Now, at long range, in a rough sea, a hit rate for battleships' guns might be somewhere between 2 and 5%. But at short ranges, the rate rises dramatically. So, whilst it's impossible to say with certainty how many of the 719 14-inch and 16-inch battleship shells that were fired at her actually hit Bismarck, it's likely to have been well over 100. Well, is this the end of the story? Well, not quite. On the 14th of June, 1989, the deep sea explorer Dr. Robert Ballard, who had discovered the wreck of the Titanic, announced that he had found the wreck of both the Hood and the Bismarck. Bismarck lies upright at a depth of about 3 miles. Here are surviving crew members looking at a film of the wreck, and von Mullenheim-Rechberg is on the extreme left. And here are some of the photographs taken by the expedition's deep submersible, and I've included some before and after photographs amongst them. See the armored door, very thick. There's an armored door on a separate ship that gives you the idea of how thick they were. There is the armored door, it's open. That's the other side of the bridge, and the armored door there is missing due to a direct hit. There is where one of the turrets would have been sitting, and it's had a direct hit on the side of the barbette, which the turret sits on. The more direct hits, and there you are. It's looking down into one of the main gun turret barbettes, and this is an interesting photograph because it shows quite clearly, you can work out the path of the heavy shell which hit the barbette on which the gun turret was sitting. It would have hit the barbette and exploded, and you can work this out because the thin deck has been blown down by the explosion, whereas the armor, the very thick, I think it was 11-inch armor on the side of the barbette, has been blown away inside as a scab. And anybody who's seen tank targets on ranges will know what I mean by that. You can see that the shells come in, hit from the outside, and blown a great big scab off the interior. Wouldn't have done the turret or its crew any good at all. That's von Mullenheim-Reckberg's position in the bottom, and that's the rangefinder at the top, which was hit. That is the door that he escaped from. And you can see that it's the number of the door, U145, is still visible. The ship had a swastika. The stern area broke off at some stage during the sinking, and you can still see half the swastika where the stern broke off. Propellers, and for the boaters amongst you, you'll recognize the sacrificial anodes that are still in place. And that pretty much explains what you can see there. That's HMS HOOD, by the way. That's the bow, anchor chain lying across it. There's Prince Eugen, and that's where she is today. She was used during an American atomic bomb test, and she developed a leak, and she capsized and sank several days after the atomic bomb went off. One of her propellers was removed, and it's now on display in Larbo near Kiel at the German Naval Museum. That's it. So let's sum up Bismarck. Was she an outstanding ship? Indeed, was she virtually unsinkable? Well, she was certainly a beautiful and well-balanced ship. She was a fine ship, but she wasn't an outstanding ship, and she certainly wasn't unsinkable. A single Royal Navy battleship might have been badly damaged or sunk in a one-to-one engagement with Bismarck, but there would always have been another British battleship to take that one's place, but that wasn't the case with the Bismarck.